said the talks was made that they would continue. Details we're not getting right, and the key detail is have the Iranians agreed not to try
Hi
to charge
guys,
tolls on
welcome
the
to
Strait
my
of Hormuz,
channel.
which is
Let's
the main
challenge
issue
level up
in play right
together.
now. Both countries
Today
have got their
I'm
blockades
trying
ongoing at the moment, but the main
153.
hostilities are
Let's
sort of
do it.
abated. Perhaps President Trump will get more insights from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when he leaves here tomorrow, heads to Washington for the funeral of Lindsey Graham, but he'll meet President Trump at the White House on Tuesday. Is very likely to give the president an update on the latest intelligence that the Israelis have. And of course, they've had intelligence that's pointed towards Pickaxe Mountain in Iran as a site where Iran may have tried to secure some of its highly enriched uranium and other centrifuges and other equipment that it uses to enrich uranium. So there may well be new information put in front of the president by the Israeli Prime Minister, who is keen, perhaps, let's not say for the war to continue, but the war pausing the way it has caused him political hardship at home. And he's got elections coming up in 3 months, so he'll be minded to try to find a way to persuade President Trump that there is still work to be done on Iran and perhaps present a roadmap for that. He'll also likely thank President Trump for putting a sort of a speed bump in the path over Saudi Arabia's civilian nuclear deal with the United States by saying that Saudi must normalize with Israel before that can go ahead. That's something the Israeli Prime Minister is grateful for. Big picture, did those talks give the product?
As new reporting about a key meeting related to the U.S. war with Iran, a source and U.S. officials say that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned President Trump about potential consequences if he escalates the war. According to those sources, Kane expressed concerns about further depleting the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative effects. Now, it's unclear if that's why the U.S. decided to suspend nearly 2 weeks of attacks against Iran. The U.S. military has conducted, or rather continued, its naval blockade of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command posted on social media yesterday that it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea that violated that blockade. CNN international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson is with us now. Nick, it's all happening ahead of that meeting between President Trump, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, their first since the start face-to-face in this war.
Yeah, and it's going to be an important one because Prime Minister Netanyahu has not been happy with the ceasefire that was put in place several months ago, and it's not clear where he stands on the current pause that's underway at the moment. He was speaking to the government this morning. He said that he'd be leaving for Washington tomorrow and that he would be meeting with President Trump on Tuesday, that all pending issues were going to be discussed, including Iran. So I think everyone here imagines that's pretty much going to be front and center. We've watched Omani diplomacy over the last couple Saturday. The conversation was about the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, what the United States wants to see is Iran relinquish its desire and commitment to having some kind of payment method, some kind of continued control over ships coming and going from the Strait of Hormuz. It's not clear if Oman has made any headway there, but it perhaps was this sort of pause has allowed that diplomacy to happen. So the question is, how will the president view the outcome of the conversations the Omanis had? But as you say, the United States continuing its blockade, the Iranians doing the same, saying that they've stopped 6 ships from going into the Strait of Hormuz, not by fire, but they're saying those ships have been now put at anchor. But the U.S. Central Command saying that they have told 12 ships and stopped 12 ships from passing through the Strait of Hormuz over the last few days during the current bout of conflict. So where it goes from here, this really does seem to be a matter of whether diplomacy has been able to take advantage of this pause.
Developments in the war with
Right.
Iran. Today, a
Has
U.S.
it.
source tells CNN military
So now
operations
we
with Iran are
challenge
currently
level
on a hold.
154.
That pause
Let's go.
comes as we are learning new details about a key White House meeting President Trump held on Friday focused on the war. A U.S. official and a source familiar with the matter tells CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned the president about potential consequences of escalating the conflict. The sources say Kane gave Trump his military options, but he also expressed concerns about further depletion of the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative implications of ramping up the war. CNN's Betsy Klein is joining us right now from the White House. Betsy, what more can you tell us about this meeting?
Right, Frederica, this could go down as one of the more consequential meetings of this 5-month-long conflict with Iran now. But President Trump huddling with top advisors and cabinet officials on Friday to discuss options for an escalation in this war with Iran. But after that meeting, 2 consecutive nights without strikes after 13 days of attacks. Now, one U.S. source says that military operations are on a hold as they give the diplomatic discussions some time to play out. We heard earlier today from U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, addressing that pause. Listen.
I've spoken with Secretary Hegseth. What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks, some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level, from the more technical aspect of it all the way to the highest levels, of course, within both the Iranian government and the U.S. government.
Now, in that Friday meeting, 2 sources say that both Vice President J.D. Vance and U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane raised concerns about the possibility of an escalation. And we've heard President Trump telegraph the possibility of massive attacks for weeks now. That could be attacks on critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, as well as that key oil hub of Karg Island. And doing so, some have warned, could constitute war crimes. But one of the other concerns that Kane raised during that meeting, according to one of the sources, was the U.S. munitions stockpile. We heard from Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell. He says in a statement, quote, "We have executed multiple successful operations across combatant commands while ensuring the U.S. military possesses a deep arsenal of capabilities to protect our people and our interests." Now, sources say that in that same meeting, other concerns were raised to the president, including the possibility of massive civilian casualties in Iran, the concerns about a refugee crisis potentially, as well as this conflict spilling into a broader regional conflict. Now, there are few people at this point in the president's inner circle that believe that the escalation options the president has been presented are going to yield the results that he is hoping for. So he's plotting a path forward with all this information. We'll wait to see what happens tonight, Frederica.
Israeli forces used tear gas and arrested dozens of Palestinians. This was in the occupied West Bank on Saturday. This is video from the village of Tel, where just a day earlier, clashes left 4 Palestinians and 2 Israeli soldiers dead. On the orders of the Prime Minister, the Israeli military began preparing for a large-scale operation, canceling leave and getting ready to send in reinforcements. Paramedic described how people in the village are feeling.
People here are scared of what happened yesterday, noting that around 8 houses were set on fire in the village, and vehicles as well. So people started taking precautions and buying fire extinguishers and first aid kits to be able to tend to the incidents until the needed services and paramedics arrive.
But some Israelis are coming together to condemn settler assaults on Palestinians in the West Bank. Here's a look at Tel Aviv on Saturday, filled with people chanting and carrying eye-catching signs. The deadly incident Friday in the West Bank came amid a marked escalation in settler attacks in the territory. The UN has called for urgent action to stop the violence. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is set to visit the U.S. this week. He's going to meet with President Trump at the White House on Tuesday. While he's in the U.S., Mr. Netanyahu is also expected to attend the funeral for the late Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. This is the Prime Minister's 7th visit to the U.S. to meet with the president and comes, of course, at President Trump's invitation. Joining me now from Jerusalem is Yaakov Katz. He is the co-founder of the Middle East America Dialogue, an author and a senior columnist, at the Jerusalem Post. Thank you so much for joining us, first of all, Yaakov. I want to talk, of course, about this visit that will take place on Tuesday. And we know Iran's going to be at the top of the agenda. We know as well that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been opposed to negotiations. So let's get into the details here. What plans, ideas, alternatives is he going to pitch to President Trump on the Tehran front? How is he going to try to shape Washington's next move here?
Well, I think that in Israel, there's a feeling of, Salma, of like a bad taste, the way that the war has been going and the way it ended with that MOU in the middle of June that didn't really pan out because, as we've seen, except for the last 2 days, almost 2 weeks of every single day airstrikes by the Americans against Iran, which is refusing to capitulate and basically give in to what Trump's basic demands have been, to give up the nuclear program, to open the Strait of Hormuz, and to stop the continued buildup of their military capabilities. Israel would like to see more strikes, more extensive, to include more targets. And I think that that's what Netanyahu is coming to Washington is to discuss with Trump. Okay, what are these next steps going to be? How do we make sure that a bad deal is potentially not reached? But at the same time, Salma, we have to keep in mind, Netanyahu is very sensitive and aware of the fact that there is a growing voice or sound within Washington, especially within the Republican Party, that it was him and it was Israel that dragged the United States and Donald Trump specifically into this war. He doesn't want to be seen as doing that again. So he's going to have to balance both of these interests very carefully. On the one hand, try to get out of Trump what he can on Iran. On the other hand, not be seen as, again, the guy who's the warmonger who's dragging America into what has already been called the forever war.
So let's delve into that further, because this is the crux of the issue here, right? Is this up and down relationship between Netanyahu and Trump over the last few months? Give me a current state of play, if you will, of their relationship. Does he really have President Trump's ear at this moment, or is he going to be unheard, as you said, because of these criticisms in Washington?
Well, I mean, that's a real good question, because what we've looked and we've seen over the last few weeks is that there is a strain in the relationship. It's no secret. I mean, just listen to Vice President J.D. Vance's comments in that podcast interview with Joe Rogan, things that he said about a campaign, this alleged campaign that the Israeli government has launched in America against. Very hostile relations between Netanyahu and Erdogan. He's met with the Iraqi prime minister. He's met with the Lebanese president. Netanyahu has been trying to get a meeting with Trump for several weeks and hasn't succeeded. Now he's been able to connect that with the funeral of the late Senator Lindsey Graham that's supposed to also take place on Tuesday. So he's able to combine between the two. But Israel has been, and you can see this, it's quite apparent, has been pushed aside from the point in the beginning few weeks of the war. Joint planning, joint deliberations, joint strategy. Now it's as if Israel's not even in the room. So Netanyahu wants to try to get back in that room, not only, but also back at a chair at the table in making those decisions. Will Trump give him that? I mean, it will depend on what mood the president's in, on what the atmosphere is like, and basically also what Israel's bringing on its own and what it can bring as an advantage to the next steps on Iran.
So let's talk about that, because like you said, Netanyahu wants to be back in that room. These men, both Netanyahu and Trump, are all about the art of the deal. What concessions or sweeteners may be offered? Because we know that President Trump is losing patience on Gaza. He's losing patience on Lebanon. He's losing patience on Iran. Is there a deal here that Prime Minister Netanyahu could offer, or a concession to ease that?
Well, I mean, he's also probably, I'm guessing that President Trump is also watching what's happening in the West Bank, as you reported just a few minutes ago, and seeing also how there's increasing violence there. And he's not going to be happy with that situation either. So there's a lot of multiple fronts that Israel continues to find itself in without really a resolution on any of them. I mean, in Lebanon, it's probably the most optimistic. We have this pilot program. The Israeli Defense Forces are moving out of southern Lebanese villages, and the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, is moving in and to fill the void and hopefully prevent Hezbollah from returning. But you're right, Gaza's stuck, West Bank, there's no political horizon, and Iran, it doesn't seem like anything's moving forward. I think that what Trump might want out of Netanyahu, unless they're about to go again towards a joint offensive against the Iranians, is sit tight, let me reach a political resolution, and don't ruin it for me. There were those voices that we heard in the immediate aftermath of the MOU in June, that because of the continued violence between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, which I think was completely legitimate on Israel's part, it has to defend itself, but still perception was that whenever Israel defended itself in the north and attacked in Lebanon, the Iranians used that as an excuse not to agree to an agreement with the Americans. So Trump might want Netanyahu, he'll say, Bibi, just sit tight, let me get this agreement, don't get in the way. Can Netanyahu be seen as doing that with the elections on the horizon? Let's remember, Salma, Israel has its own elections, October 27th. Netanyahu needs to be seen as standing firm, standing tough, standing up to whatever some other foreign leader tells him to do. He can't give in that easily.
This morning on the U.S. war in Iran. It involves a key meeting that President Trump had on Friday. Now, a source and U.S. official tell CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane came to warn President Trump at a meeting about escalating the war. The sources say that Kane told Trump his military options, but he also expressed concerns about further depleting the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative consequences. Now, it's unclear if those reasons prompted the U.S. to pause what had been nearly 2 consecutive weeks of strikes on Iran. The U.S. military has continued its naval blockade, though, of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command posted on social media yesterday that it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea that violated that blockade. Let's go now to CNN International diplomatic editor Nick Robertson. What is the Trump administration saying about the concerns of escalation ahead of this meeting with Netanyahu on Tuesday?
Yeah, the concern is, this is something that analysts CNN have spoken
Let's
to as
challenge
well, have said
again
the
the
defensive missile systems like the THAAD,
156.
the Patriot, a lot of them were used up defending against all those incoming Iranian missiles in the earlier part of the war a few months ago. So that's a concern. A significant number of Tomahawks, also an land attack weapon, also used up. So if you commit more weapon systems to another round of fighting, then you reduce your options for another war or another conflict in another theater around the world. That was, from what we understand, was the concern raised. What it has allowed, this pause, whatever the reason, and diplomats I'm talking to are sort of referring to this as an unannounced ceasefire, if you will, that's now gone through 2 nights. It's given an opportunity for an Omani delegation to go to Tehran. They went Friday, stayed into Saturday, left late
It's not
Saturday
hard,
to have
but
conversations.
must
The Iranian
be
foreign
very
minister saying that there was progress in those
So
talks,
this
that they
is
focused
my
on the
third
Strait of
time
Hormuz.
to
But
challenge
there's
the same
absolutely no
level.
indication here whatsoever that the Iranians have given ground on their core point on the Strait of Hormuz, which is they want to have control over it and be able to make money out of it in the future. The Iranians also have spoken about how they've caused a number of vessels, 6 vessels, to go to anchor and not transit the Strait of Hormuz. I think when you step back just a tiny little bit and look at the messaging from both the US side, the Iranian side, both operating their blockades, but not signaling it through maximalist shooting of ships, but sort of a one tempo down, if you will, the boarding and inspection and the ships being put at anchor. Can this pause for diplomacy hold? And as discussed here, the cost of an escalation, there are implications with that, and that was what was explained to the president.
A new round of tariffs just kicked in on almost every single U.S. import. Here's why. The U.S. claims that 60 of its trading partners are using forced labor to produce goods exported to the U.S. These tariffs hit Friday, just after another similar tariff expired. So while it won't hit your wallet too much, rising gas prices will. We'll talk about it, of course. All the factors that have prevented oil from surging recently are either weaker or gone. I'm joined now by Washington correspondent for Yahoo Finance, Ben Worskell. Ben, welcome back to the show. Let's start with the tariffs. The tariffs have been unpopular here across the U.S. since so-called Liberation Day. While these tariffs are not nearly as high as the ones implemented that were shut down by the Supreme Court, you've got reporting about the impact and how much it's really going to affect the imports coming in from around the world.
Yeah, good to be with you. These tariffs are, as you mentioned, these tariffs are kind of a changeover of sorts to new tariff authorities that aren't going to have a lot of impacts immediately, but there is a lot of evidence here that what Trump is trying to do is set up more tariffs down the road as he goes forward. The main headline this week was a switch up of tariffs from 10% tariffs that expired on Friday at midnight to new tariffs of 10 to 12.5% that came into effect at 12:01. So just 1 minute later on this issue of forced labor you mentioned here. This doesn't change the tariff rate, but it does create a more legally durable option that the White House thinks they can build on. We're expecting more investigations there in the months ahead that could raise these rates, even as they don't change now. Another important strand on tariffs to watch this week is Trump's announcement on Canada. He talked about 50% tariffs on Canada that could be in effect by August on some goods. This again has sort of limited immediate effects. It impacts about 5% of U.S. imports, but this is a new tariff authority that we haven't seen from Trump before. He's reaching all the way back to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 for this. This is a much more quick acting option that has a lot of legal problems. The question whether this stands up in court is a big one, but the sense I get from listening to the administration and talking to trade officials is that they're trying to see if this will stick, if this will stand up in court, and if Trump can do this, we could see a lot more from that in the months ahead. But the bottom line, as you mentioned,
holding at this hour amid growing concerns over the conflict escalating further. Sources telling CNN the president was briefed by Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan Kane on Friday. The general reportedly telling Trump that carrying out more aggressive moves could further deplete stockpiles, along with other potential downsides. Some Republican lawmakers also signaling some uncertainty about the direction of this war.
At some point, date certain, it'll be that Congress has to weigh in. It may be soon, but in my mind, the presidents have the opportunity to achieve the initial goals, which I agreed with. To wrap it up, it's not happening. At this point, I do think there needs to be a fuller national discussion as to how we go forward.
Joining us now in the group chat, retired Lieutenant General Karen Gibson, former Deputy Director of National Intelligence and a Senior Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Strategies. General, it's good to have you here. So when we parse through what we're hearing, right, about these concerns that were raised by General Kane, about the military stockpiles in this moment, what does it tell you about the math here?
Well, I think at any time that you're using weapons faster than the industrial base can replenish them, then of course your stockpiles are going to diminish to some point. The question is it dangerous? What kinds of shortages might we encounter? And it's important to remember that it's not just U.S. forces that use these expensive interceptors, but also our Gulf partners. We provide similar kinds of capacity in the past in the Republic of Korea or to Ukraine. And so it can become a global supply problem if we are depleting them too rapidly. And each time that Iran launches missiles or one-way attack drones, it requires the expenditure of these scarce resources.
So to your point, right, about where else these munitions are being used, I want to play a little bit of what, touch on this briefly, but we have the sound now. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Mike Waltz, had to say about that specifically.
We inherited a difficult situation with many of our munitions having been given over in Ukraine, a lot of them expended in the Houthis, but we are rebuilding with cheaper, faster, more technologically capable as we are conducting this campaign.
Recognizing, what has happened before, it does beg the question of, shouldn't that have been taken into account before going into this war, knowing that it could last longer?
Yeah, so I would say two things. One, I think the shortfalls in the defense industrial base have been long-standing. It's one of the 4 priorities of the new defense strategy is to rebuild that. But two, certainly I think the initial planning for this campaign did not anticipate that it would go this long.
We have heard from the president about how Iran's military capabilities have been depleted. What are you seeing?
Yeah, so they've been dramatically depleted, right? But not eliminated. And frankly, eliminating them is darn near impossible. You look at the very narrow Strait of Hormuz that we're trying to protect and the vast geography from which Iran can attack it with cheap, relatively easy to produce, easy to hide, one-way attack drones. And when I, as an intelligence professional, look at an enemy's, what they might do, I look at two things. One, what is their will and intent? And Iran has been very clear that they intend to control navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. And what is their ability to do so? And in terms of their ability to do so, we've degraded that considerably, but not eliminated it. And in terms of their will and intent, there's really no indications that we've moved the needle on that. They still insist that they will control the straits. And so I'm not sure, well, it's been tactically effective and tactically we've degraded tremendous capabilities. We haven't achieved our strategic
I just want to ask you one more question on that point. So Aaron David Miller over the weekend was talking on CNN. I spoke with him a little bit about this yesterday, talking about, there's also the will of Iranian leadership to keep going, to be able to inflict pain on their own people. That is incredibly strong.
Oh, yes.
And is it proving to be more strong in this moment than you think was anticipated?
Well, I think some people underestimated the willingness, one, of the Islamic Republic or the men who are in charge to absorb pain. And the well-being of the Iranian people has never been a top priority. I think people also forget that for them, this is an existential fight for the survival of the state. And so their willingness and ability to absorb that kind of pain, whether it's in the form of punishing airstrikes or years-long sanctions regimes, is very high. They are not making the kind of calculations that a nation who put their economic livelihood as their top priority would make. You know, I think there were perhaps some assumptions that they won't choke off the strait because it'll hurt them economically. They won't attack Gulf states because they need them to remain neutral. And those are the kind of rational decisions that a nation that was economically minded might make. But when you're in an existential fight for the survival of the Islamic Republic, your calculus is different.
And in terms of the calculus, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but the fact that, and we heard from Senator Cassidy there, right? The fact that congressional funding, right, is going to kind of plays an important role here. Sarah, how do you see all of this figuring in now in this moment as the American people, as we know from every poll that comes out, are increasingly dissatisfied with where things stand?
Well, I'll tell you, one thing that Americans don't think about, but you know that military officials think about, strategic officials think about, is if we were to get into a situation where allies depended on us, let's say China were to invade Taiwan and our stockpile is low, that is a very, very serious long-term national security issue for us. Now, I don't think that the American people are demanding answers to that of their politicians as we head into the midterms. What they are demanding answers on is the economic priorities that you just mentioned, and those things are going to be very, very seriously felt if we cannot figure out the stockpile issues. So, for example, if we cannot figure this out with the street doesn't remain open and we can't get free trade to go through, there's no way gas prices are going down ahead of the midterms. By the way, even if we got the strait open, there's probably no way that they're going to go down in time for midterms. That's the biggest priority for voters right now. And if you're Congress, you don't want to be in a position where you're voting against funding in a way that it's going to come down to the way that it's hitting people's prices at the pump, in grocery stores, and all those things. So they've got some delicate dancing to do. But I do think that the bigger strategic concern is it's not actually about some of those short-term economic pains. It's what do we do if we have no stockpile, China invades Taiwan, our allies in the southeastern part of the world are dependent on us, that becomes a pretty serious problem.
All right, breaking this morning, global oil prices falling sharply. Look at that. Brent crude was up over $100 a barrel at one point last week. Why is it dropping? The United States appears to have paused its bombing raids on Iran. New reporting suggests high-level concerns in the administration about dwindling reserves of U.S. air defense munitions. Let's get ready to CNN's Kevin Liptak at the White House. Pretty interesting. What's the White House saying about this, Kevin?
Yeah, and we have now had 3 days of relative calm after that 13-day stretch where we saw those night-by-night attacks, and it does come even after the president was threatening this major escalation in Iran. There was a discussion at the White House on Friday discussing both the efficacy of those night-by-night strikes, but also about the potential risks for escalation. And what we're told is that both the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, raised concerns about escalation, and that Kane in particular has warned about the potential for dwindling stockpiles of U.S. Munitions, including air defense interceptors. Now, the administration strongly denies that that is an issue. What Mike Walls, the American ambassador to the United Nations, said yesterday is that, quote, the military has everything it needs to conduct this campaign as effectively as it needs to be, and also claiming, somewhat contradictory there, that anyone leaking information about
this
weapons
is a
stockpiles
super
deserves
easy
to
one.
be in jail. Now, there were a few other
Now we
concerns that
challenge
were raised in this meeting, including the
159.
potential for a wider regional retaliation. The president also hearing concerns about the potential for civilian deaths inside of Iran if he went after some of those civilian infrastructure sites that he'd been repeatedly warning he would attack, including bridges, power plants, that sort of thing. Now, what the administration is also saying today is that they want space for the diplomacy to proceed, and I am told this morning that that is still continuing. The mediators, including Pakistan and Qatar, still in discussions to try and get the two sides back to the negotiating table. You also have Iran and Oman discussing ways to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. What you've seen President Trump doing over the weekend is continuing this relatively belligerent approach on social media. He posted almost a dozen AI-generated images of the U.S. seizing oil tankers, of the U.S. striking Karg Island, including oil sites on that very critical export site. Now, the president still continuing to have these diplomatic discussions. He's also expected to discuss the whole situation with the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. He's visiting the U.S. for Lindsey Graham's funeral tomorrow. Israel has made pretty clear that it thinks the U.S. has unfinished business inside of Iran.
Now, the top U.S. official says that President Trump is giving talks with Iran, quote unquote, some space. Now, after nearly 2 straight weeks of nightly bombing, there is also new reporting that suggests that the president is facing growing warnings from within about escalating this further. Fresh concern raised by some of his closest advisors, concern from both the vice president, J.D. Vance, and the Joint Chiefs Chairman, General Dan Kane. According to a source familiar, General Kane even specifically raised worry about depleting the U.S. munitions stockpiles further if the fighting continues. Also, overnight, Iranian officials ramped up their threats towards Ukraine. This is after Ukraine this weekend launched an attack on an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea. Let's talk about where things stand then now with CNN Global Affairs analyst Brett McGurk. He's also the author of the new book coming out, Brink, Inside the Race to Free the October 7th Hostages. It's good to see you. Thanks for being here. So let's talk about, they're in a pause moment.
So
that seems to
difficult.
be, I think, the only clear thing when it
Now
comes to
we
the status
check
quo. 2 weeks of
160.
U.S. bombing
Let's do
runs
it.
on Iran have seemed to fail to break the deadlock over the Strait of Hormuz still. And now you have reporting that there's this concern that was raised this week about further depleting munition stockpiles if the president escalates this further. How do they navigate a path forward now, Brett? What do you see here?
Kate, it's tough. You know, we're 5 months tomorrow. Will be the 5-month mark of when this conflict started. And I had a saying when I used to work in the White House for various presidents, from General Eisenhower when he was president. He used to say, before we talk about decisive military action, lay out all the facts cold and hard. And it appears from the reporting from CNN and elsewhere that this meeting late last week did that and said, here are all the factors as we consider next steps. That's good. That's exactly the type of information the president should be getting. It's probably the type of meeting that should have been had before this started. Back to where it was before those strikes started 2 weeks ago. And that, I'm told, that making some progress. So tactical pause, let's see where we are, see if diplomacy can get somewhere. But otherwise, we're still kind of stuck because the key variable remains the Strait of Hormuz. And if Iran is not going to maintain that the Strait of Hormuz is its sovereign territory, it controls what goes through the strait, I don't see Washington accepting that, nor do the Gulf states accept that. And therefore, you're kind of stuck. So it's a big week, Kate. We got visits coming to Washington. Netanyahu's here, Zelensky's here. We'll see the diplomacy go. But right now, tactical pause.
Well, let's talk about the new Zelensky factor, if you will. Ukraine this weekend attacking this Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea. This is a route for much of Iran's trade with Russia. Iran responding with warnings. The new one coming overnight from an Iranian regional governor is Ukraine too may soon come to understand that Iran does not let actions go unanswered. What does this do?
Okay, this is first of all, let's step way back. Iran has been supporting Russia in its war against Ukraine directly. They provide Shahed drones. They provide technology. Russia now has a factory producing these Iranian Shahed drones, which allows Iran to prosecute its war. This has been going on for years. And Zelensky, about 3 days ago, said that the Ukrainians struck a ship in the Caspian Sea carrying military material between Russia and Iran. Iran is now claiming that this is basically an act of war, and Iran is now threatening to attack Ukraine. So this is how these two storylines are coming together. But the cooperation between Russia and Iran has been going on for some time. But this will be a topic in the Oval Office when Zelensky meets with President Trump. Totally different dynamic than that infamous meeting about 18 months ago. Now Ukraine arguably has the upper hand. There's a sanctions bill pending still in the Senate, and Zelensky's coming with some cards, and he's saying he's going to lay out for the president his information on what Russia is doing to actually support Iran in its conflict against us. So this is how these two strands come together. The cooperation between Russia, Iran, and China is a larger backdrop to everything we're talking about day by day here, Kate, and that'll be a very important meeting in the Oval Office this week.
All right, thank you, Kate. This morning, global oil prices are falling sharply as the U.S. and Iran have so far paused strikes for the third day in a row. No strikes from either side after nearly 2 straight weeks of nightly bombing. And this comes as U.S. officials, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, are warning about the dwindling supply of U.S. air defense munitions. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations also weighing in, saying President Trump is giving diplomatic efforts a chance.
What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level.
CNN's Zach Cohen is joining me now. Zach, he also said that the U.S. ambassador to the UN, that the troops have all they need when it comes to this fight with Iran. But we're hearing about these dwindling munitions. What's the sense of what's going on here, Zach?
Yes, Sarah. Ambassador Waltz did say that the U.S. has all the munitions it needs, but that does not line up with what we've been reporting since back in April, when analysts and Pentagon data has shown that the Pentagon's munition stockpile, including these key missile defense systems, are running low because of the high frequency with which they're being used during this war with Iran. And while the White House and the Trump administration is arguing that this temporary pause over the last 3 days is intended to give space for diplomacy, we've learned new details about a consequential meeting that took place at the White House on Friday when discussions were being had about potentially escalating the conflict with Iran. All of the president's top advisors were in the room, we're told, and there were some hard truths laid out for the president by both Vice President J.D. Vance and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, both of them warning about potential concerns related to the options for escalating this conflict. And Kane, in particular, pointed to these warnings about the U.S.'s diminishing stockpile of key munitions, saying that if the U.S. continues to use them at the clip that they've been using them so far in this conflict, they may not have enough for the next war, especially if it's against an adversary like China or Russia. Now, this is just one of the concerns, we're told, that was raised during this meeting on Friday that ultimately preceded the ongoing temporary pause. The other concerns that were raised included potentially massive amounts of civilian casualties inside Iran if the U.S. were to follow through with Trump's threat to strike civilian infrastructure, things like power plants and bridges, things of that nature. We're also told that concerns about retaliation against both energy infrastructure and a broader regional escalation were also mentioned. So ultimately, those concerns all taken into account seem to have led to this current pause, but there's still so many questions about whether or not diplomacy can ultimately back on track and bring an end to this war.
All right, now to new CNN reporting about a key White House meeting President Trump held on Friday focused on the U.S. war with Iran.
A U.S. official and a source familiar with the matter tell CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned the president about potential consequences of escalating the war. The sources say Kane gave Trump his military options, but he also expressed concerns about further depletion of the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative consequences. A U.S. Defense Department source says military operations are currently on hold, but it's unclear if that Friday White House meeting prompted the U.S. to pause what had been nearly 2 weeks of strikes on Iran. CNN's Betsy Klein is joining us right now. Betsy, what more can you tell us about this meeting, the president's plans for the war going forward?
Frederica, President Trump spending part of his Friday with top advisors and cabinet officials discussing the possibility of escalating this war with Iran. But now we are seeing an apparent pause in that fighting after 13 consecutive nights of strikes. One U.S. official saying that military operations are on a hold as we are seeing these diplomatic discussions pick back up after that ceasefire fell apart just a few weeks ago. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Mike Waltz addressing that pause earlier today. Listen.
I've spoken with Secretary Hegseth. What the president is doing right now,
Now we are
as we've seen all along, is
level
giving some talks,
162.
some space.
Let's go.
Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level, from the more technical aspect of it all the way to the highest levels, of course, within both the Iranian government and the U.S. government.
Now, in that Friday White House meeting, we are learning, according to our sources, that Vice President J.D. Vance, along with Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, both raised concerns about escalating this conflict. The president in the past has threatened massive attacks. That could include critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, Karg Island, which is a key oil hub, along with Pickaxe Mountain, which is believed to be a nuclear site. Now, that could constitute war crimes, potentially. And Kane, in that meeting, specifically raised concerns about U.S. munitions stockpiles. We've heard now from Pentagon spokesperson Sean Parnell. He says in a statement, quote, "We have executed multiple successful operations across combatant commands while ensuring the U.S. military possesses a deep arsenal of capabilities to protect our people and our interests." Now, sources say that other major concerns were raised to the president in that meeting. That includes the possibility of massive civilian casualties in Iran, as well as a potential refugee crisis, as well as this idea that this could spill into a broader regional conflict. But there are few people within President Trump's inner circle that believe that these options for escalation are going to yield the results that President Trump is hoping for. Frederica.
All right, Betsy Klein, keep us posted there from the White House. Thank you. All right, meantime, Iran says it held talks with Oman in Tehran about boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea that violated the blockade. At the same time, a new front in the war is opening in the Red Sea, where Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen have exchanged attacks with Saudi Arabia. That conflict threatening another critical oil corridor. CNN's Nick Robertson joins us right now. Nick, we've got this apparent U.S. pause on strikes in Iran. How might that impact peace talks overall?
It gives them an opportunity. We heard from the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman today saying that
My
there
bad,
was
my
progress,
bad.
that the talks
I
were
have
constructive,
on
that
the
they
wrong
continue at a
line.
political and technical level.
Oh,
but
this-
it's key
this is my second time
understanding the details.
challenge
We just don't
the
have
same
them.
level,
The talks were all about the Strait of
162.
Hormuz, of course. And the
Let's
key point
go.
here is, do the Iranians finally agree that they give up control of the Strait of Hormuz and allow traffic to pass through, marine traffic, and not try to get any tolls and not tell them which passages and pathways to go down through the Strait of Hormuz? And there's no indication that's about to happen. So it will be the output of that meeting, what the Omanis pass on to the U.S. diplomats, what the White House gets back from those talks is going to determine the next moves. Clearly, the implication we've heard from Ambassador Waltz, from the Pentagon, from the indications from the White House, is this is a sort of unannounced temporary ceasefire type deal to make the space for diplomacy. But it's not clear just because you're talking that there's actually going to be an outcome that's good enough for the White House. I think on the Houthi front in the Red Sea and trying to stop the Saudi oil getting out to world markets, it's having a chilling effect. But as far as we know today, the Houthis haven't fired any additional missiles at Saudi infrastructure. So perhaps, you know, they're aligned with Iran. So perhaps they're taking a beat on all of this at the moment as well. And then, of course, tomorrow, Prime Minister Netanyahu will leave Israel. He'll head to the United States for the funeral of Lindsey Graham, but it also is meeting at the White House with President Trump on Tuesday. We can expect the Israeli Prime Minister to thank the president for announcing that Saudi Arabia has to normalize with Israel before it can have this civilian nuclear deal. But also the key thing there will be what intelligence does Prime Minister Netanyahu share with President Trump about Iranian nuclear assets. Where are they? Of course, it was the Israelis that had a lot of information about leading towards the Pickaxe Mountain as being a storage facility for some of the highly enriched uranium and other nuclear storage sites that the Iranians have. So what else is Prime Minister Netanyahu going to put on President Trump's desk that then may influence where this war goes next?
All right, very complex. Nick Robertson, thank you so much. All right, let's continue this conversation. With us now is Ali Reza Nader. He's the president of the Nader Research Group. There is a pause in fighting right now, and Iran is talking with Omanis about the Strait of Hormuz. But I wonder, in your view, what kind of diplomacy talks continue, and with whom? I mean, we've heard Mr. Waltz say that even the U.S. at the highest levels is still continuing to be part of the diplomacy talks. But I wonder, with this hold on U.S. military operations, what kind of impact these talks might have?
Thanks for having me. I think both sides
Yes,
really
I
want
did
this
it.
conflict to end. The Trump administration realizes that it is stuck in a quagmire, and the
Now we
economy in
started
Iran is
to
suffering
challenge
greatly.
Level
The regime is under a huge pressure,
163.
and it wants
Let's
to
go.
get the most out of its discussions with Washington, D.C. So I think the last few days of military action we've seen from the United States and from Iran is really meant to increase each side's leverage so they can get a better deal out of these upcoming negotiations. Oman has been a mediator between the two sides. It has very good relations with Iran, and will continue to play a big role, I think, in future negotiations.
And then you stated that, you know, U.S. attacks on civilian infrastructure inside Iran is actually strengthening the regime. Why do you believe that is the case? How do you know that is the case?
Look, before this war started in January, there were huge peaceful protests against the regime. Really a revolutionary movement in Iran that was disrupted by this war. Right now, the U.S. is conducting lots of attacks against military facilities in Iran, but civilians are getting hit very hard as well. I'm very concerned about the U.S.-Israeli strategy of destroying Iran's critical water and energy infrastructure because Iran is on the brink of economic and environmental collapse. And the U.S. destroying these facilities is not going to hurt the regime, it's going to hurt ordinary people. Most of the regime's military assets and its senior leadership and Iran's political leadership is underground. They're pretty safe from these bombs.